Welcome to Ace My Exams Learning. Let us get started with today's learning.
History Grade 12. Question: The handling of Chris Hani's murder in 1993 was the only example of good leadership from party leaders during the negotiation process from 1990 that led to a new political dispensation in South Africa in 1994. Do you agree with this statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. To answer this question effectively, observe the following. 1. Analyze the question. Identify the instruction verb, do you agree, and focus on the phrase, Hani's assassination, as the only example of good leadership, the time frame, 1990 to 1994, and determine a clear stance. 2. In the introduction, take a position that leadership was demonstrated in multiple instances. Set the context of South Africa's fragile transition and outline the essay's line of argument. 3. In the background, briefly introduce Chris Hani, his role in the ANC and SACP, and explain why his assassination was significant in an already volatile political climate. 4. Use the body paragraphs to present well-structured, evidence-based points demonstrating leadership throughout the transition. 5. In the conclusion, restate the stance, summarize the evidence of continuous, multifaceted leadership, and emphasize that Hani's assassination was a pivotal, but not the sole, example of responsible leadership during the transition. Here is the essay. The early 1990s in South Africa marked a nation in transition. Apartheid laws were being dismantled. Political organizations such as the ANC and PAC had been unbanned, and negotiations were underway to create a democratic constitution. However, this process was far from smooth. The country was plagued by political violence, ethnic tensions, and distrust between liberation movements and the apartheid government. Rival factions, including the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, the far-right Conservative Party, and extremist white nationalist groups, opposed the transition and sought to derail it through violence and intimidation. The assassination of Chris Hani on the 10th of April, 1993, was one of the most tense and potentially destabilizing moments during South Africa's negotiation process from 1990 to 1994. Political leaders such as Nelson Mandela calmly and decisively responded to this crisis to prevent the country from descending into widespread violence. However, to claim that this was the only instance of good leadership during the transition oversimplifies the broader negotiation process, which was marked by repeated acts of courage, compromise, and vision by various party leaders. This essay argues that while the political leadership handling of Hani's murder was indeed significant, it formed part of a wider pattern of responsible leadership that ultimately enabled South Africa to achieve a peaceful democratic settlement. In support of this argument, the essay will examine the interventions and compromises made by leaders on both sides of the negotiation process, the strategies employed to contain violence, and the steps taken to ensure that the 1994 elections could be held successfully. Chris Hani was one of South Africa's most prominent anti-apartheid leaders, widely respected for his dedication, courage, and influence within the liberation struggle. As the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, SACP, and Chief of Staff of Umkhonto we Sizwe MK, the armed wing of the African National Congress, ANC, Hani symbolized the militant determination of the liberation movement. He was admired by many young black South Africans who saw him as a fearless revolutionary and a potential future leader of the post-apartheid nation. His assassination in the midst of an already volatile political climate marked by ongoing violence, including massacres such as Boipatong and Bisho, tensions with the Inkatha Freedom Party, and sporadic attacks by right-wing groups like the AWB, sent shockwaves throughout the nation, provoking mass demonstrations, strikes, and fears of full-scale racial conflict. The nation effectively came to a standstill as citizens awaited guidance from political leaders, highlighting how a single violent act had the potential to derail years of painstaking negotiations and threaten the fragile progress toward a democratic political dispensation. The assassination of Chris Hani was an act intended to ignite racial violence and derail negotiations, yet the response of the country's leaders proved decisive and stabilizing. Nelson Mandela's measured, televised appeal for calm 3 days later channeled public grief into restraint and reaffirmed the primacy of dialogue over revenge, demonstrating moral authority that helped avert widespread chaos. At the same time, President F.W. de Klerk ensured the swift arrest of the perpetrators and resisted calls to suspend talks, showing administrative steadiness and a commitment to the rule of law that sustained the negotiation framework. Behind the scenes, the ANC and SACP leadership, figures such as Joe Slovo, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Thabo Mbeki, coordinated disciplined messaging, organized a mass, but controlled funeral, and deliberately chose to remain at the negotiating table rather than withdraw in anger, signaling that strategic restraint and long-term vision guided the movement's response. Religious and civic leaders, notably Archbishop Desmond Tutu, amplified calls for reconciliation and forgiveness, creating a broad moral front that complemented political interventions. The combined effect of these actions was to turn a potential national catastrophe into a catalyst for renewed urgency. Multi-party negotiations resumed, momentum toward a negotiated settlement intensified, and despite continuing violence, the country proceeded to its first democratic elections on 27 to the 29th of April, 1994. However, the handling of Chris Hani's assassination wasn't the only example of good leadership between 1990 and 1994. This period was marked by numerous decisive moments in which leaders from opposing political movements demonstrated courage, restraint, and vision that collectively steered South Africa away from civil war and toward democracy. The unbanning of the ANC, PAC, SACP, and other political organizations in February 1990 was one of the most decisive demonstrations of leadership during South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy. President F.W. de Klerk's announcement to lift political bans marked a turning point that ended nearly 4 decades of political suppression. This act was a direct challenge to the conservative forces within his own national party and the apartheid establishment, yet de Klerk pressed forward, recognizing that genuine reform required inclusion rather than exclusion. His decision restored legitimacy to political dialogue by allowing exiled leaders and internal activists to operate openly, reuniting fragmented movements under lawful conditions. The unbanning of these organizations sent a clear message both domestically and internationally that the government was serious about democratic transformation. It displayed courage and vision in dismantling the political barriers that had long sustained apartheid, proving that leadership was evident long before crises like the assassination of Chris Hani. The release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners later in 1990 further reflected a high level of leadership grounded in reconciliation, foresight, and political wisdom. Mandela's release after 27 years in prison was not simply an act of mercy, but a calculated and moral decision that symbolized the beginning of South Africa's rebirth. De Klerk's willingness to release Mandela, despite opposition from hardliners, showed that he understood the necessity of involving legitimate liberation leaders in the negotiation process. Upon his release, Mandela immediately demonstrated moral strength and restraint by calling for peace, forgiveness, and dialogue instead of revenge or violence. His leadership inspired both the oppressed black majority and the fearful white minority to envision a shared future. This transition from confrontation to cooperation could easily have collapsed without Mandela's disciplined approach, which guided the ANC into constructive talks and reassured the public that their leaders were committed to a peaceful settlement. His release therefore represented leadership that transcended politics, setting the ethical tone for the country's entire democratic transition. Furthermore, The Groot Schuur Minute of May 1990 and the Pretoria Minute of August 1990 illustrated cooperative and forward-looking leadership between the government and liberation movements during a period of extreme volatility. Despite ongoing violence in areas such as the Vaal Triangle and Sebokeng, leaders from both the ANC and NP showed commitment to finding common ground. These agreements addressed the release of political prisoners, the ending of hostilities, and the establishment of procedures for future talks. The Pretoria Minute was especially significant because it saw the ANC suspend its armed struggle and the government lift the state of emergency, symbolizing mutual trust and political maturity. Both Mandela and de Klerk risked alienating elements within their respective bases by choosing peace over confrontation, yet their cooperation kept the fragile negotiation process alive. These moments demonstrated that real leadership lies in the willingness to compromise and prioritize national stability over political pride, proving that leadership during the transition was continuous and strategic rather than limited to moments of crisis. The signing of the National Peace Accord in 1991 showcased collective leadership that went beyond symbolic gestures to address violence and instability threatening the negotiation process. With 27 political organizations, trade unions, and religious groups participating, the accord created mechanisms to monitor and manage political conflict across South Africa. This development revealed foresight and a deep understanding that negotiations could not succeed without peace at the community level. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi recognized that political agreements in conference halls would be meaningless if bloodshed continued in the streets and townships. The peace accord established local peace committees and structures to mediate disputes, offering a practical framework for reconciliation. It demonstrated leadership that was both moral and administrative, capable of translating national ideals into local action. By reducing tension and fostering accountability, the peace accord ensured that the negotiation process remained on course and highlighted that leadership was as much about preventing violence as it was about achieving political milestones. The first convention for a democratic South Africa, CODESA I, held in December 1991, reflected visionary leadership from both the ANC and the National Party in confronting the immense challenges of multi-party negotiations. Despite the absence of several key groups such as the IFP, PAC, and Conservative Party, 19 political organizations gathered to chart a new constitutional framework. Leaders were confronted with deep mistrust, ideological divisions, and debates over power sharing and the future of the armed forces. Yet through persistence and political skill, they produced the Declaration of Intent, a landmark document committing South Africa to a non-racial, democratic, and peaceful future. This willingness to engage across divides showed that leadership during the transition required patience, negotiation, and vision rather than quick solutions. The determination of Mandela and de Klerk to continue dialogue despite internal opposition underscored their shared leadership and belief in compromise as the path to peace. CODESA I therefore stands as evidence that leadership was a consistent and a collaborative effort to secure the principles of democracy. The 1992 whites-only referendum was another powerful example of leadership and political courage, particularly on the part of F.W. de Klerk. Having faced growing opposition from the Conservative Party and losing several by-elections, de Klerk took the bold step of asking white voters directly whether they supported continued negotiations toward a democratic South Africa. The overwhelming yes vote provided de Klerk with a renewed mandate to pursue reform and silence the right-wing factions that sought to derail the process. This event demonstrated a deep understanding of democratic accountability and the importance of public legitimacy in leadership. Simultaneously, CODESA II revealed the determination of leaders such as Mandela and de Klerk to persevere through immense difficulties, including violent incidents like the Boipatong massacre, and covert operations by elements of the Third Force. Despite breakdowns in talks, both sides continued to seek avenues for peace, showing resilience, adaptability, and a refusal to allow violence to dictate political progress. This persistence under pressure highlighted that leadership was about endurance and moral conviction as much as it was about decision-making. The Record of Understanding signed in September 1992 and the introduction of Joe Slovo's Sunset Clause in April 1993 revealed pragmatic leadership that balanced idealism with political reality. The record, negotiated by Cyril Ramaphosa for the ANC and Rolf Meyer for the NP, recommitted both sides to peace after months of tension, outlining agreements on the release of prisoners, the return of exiles, and the creation of a transitional executive council. This breakthrough was critical in restoring trust and reopening channels of communication that had nearly collapsed. Joe Slovo's Sunset Clause, which proposed a government of national unity and temporary retention of white civil servants, was equally vital. It provided security guarantees to the white minority while ensuring majority rule. These innovations demonstrated that leadership required creativity, compromise, and sensitivity to the fears of all communities. Together, they embodied a form of leadership that was inclusive, realistic, and nation-building, proving that South Africa's transition depended on negotiation skills as much as on moral courage. The decision to proceed with South Africa's first democratic elections in April 1994 despite ongoing violence and instability marked the ultimate expression of courageous and determined leadership. Bombings at ANC headquarters and Jan Smuts Airport, as well as intimidation from extremist groups, threatened to derail the process, yet leaders refused to yield to fear. The successful conduct of the elections, which saw Nelson Mandela become the country's first democratically elected president, represented the triumph of years of persistent, principled, and inclusive leadership. The formation of a government of national unity, including Thabo Mbeki and F.W. de Klerk as deputy presidents, symbolized a new era of cooperation and reconciliation. This outcome demonstrated that the peaceful transition was not the result of a single moment, but of sustained leadership from individuals and organizations committed to dialogue, compromise, and justice. The elections brought closure to decades of division and inaugurated a democratic South Africa built upon the shared vision and steadfast leadership of its key figures. In conclusion, while the assassination of Chris Hani in April 1993 was one of the most severe tests of leadership during South Africa's transition to democracy, it was by no means the only moment in which leadership was demonstrated. However, to regard this event as the only example of good leadership oversimplifies a far more complex and sustained process. Throughout the transition, from the unbanning of liberation movements and the release of political prisoners to the signing of peace accords and the perseverance through violent crises like Boipatong, Bisho, and Shell House, leaders continually showed resilience, negotiation skill, and moral conviction. The handling of Hani's murder therefore stands as a powerful example of leadership under fire, but it was part of a broader, consistent pattern of courageous, principled decision-making that collectively steered South Africa toward a peaceful democratic transition in 1994.
To access more learning and exam preparation materials, go to www.acemyexams.coza. This link is also in the video description below. Thank you for watching this video. Remember to subscribe and be the first to know when we upload new videos.